Asynchronous JavaScript basically refers to functions who run in parallel with each other. So functions that can run at the same time. So code doesn't always have to be fired in a sequence. It can, for example, have to wait for another part of the program to finish before it wants to print out a result, and then we don't want to stop the entire application and wait for that task to be completed before the user continue on doing something else. An example of this can, for example, be when you make a request to a web server to gather some data. And in the real world, this can sometimes take up to a couple of seconds, and then you don't want to have the user sit and wait for it and the program to be in a frozen state before this basically request has been resolved or cleared. And you want, therefore, the program to be able to fire off other functions during the time this request is being handled. So you can, while this request is running, you can go on and do other stuff in the program, and then when it's finished, it will print out the result and without having to stop anything on the program. So that is basically what asynchronous JavaScript means. It is functions running in parallel with basically other functions. And there, regarding asynchronous JavaScript, we're gonna cover these three different concepts that I mentioned earlier, which are callbacks, or callback functions, promises, and the async await keyword. And we're gonna start off by looking at callbacks. So a callback is basically a function that is passed as a parameter to another function, and then thereby can be called within that function. And this can be great because you might want to finish off a certain type of computation in one function before you pass the result of that computation onto another function, before we, for example, want to display it out on the screen. So we don't have to wait for example, a whole long sequence in one function to be resolved before we can continue on with doing something else. So, as I said, a callback is a function that gets passed as a parameter to another function, and what this basically looks like is if we would have, for example, a function here that we will call, maybe we can make a basic calculation function. So we say we create a new function called calculate, and this, I will make this an arrow function, and I will, as parameters for these functions, I will set two different numbers that we're going to add together, which will be passed to this function by when we call it. So number 1 and number 2. And then I also want to pass this calculate function a callback function, which basically will be another function that is responsible for just logging out the result into the console. And the way we usually define these callback function is by just calling them callback, but it's also quite common to just see this CB. So what do I want to do here? Well, here I want to create a variable called sum, and I want to set this to the first number that we pass to the function plus the second number that we pass to the function. So the sum will be number 1 plus number 2. So if we invoke this function and give, for example, pass 5 as a parameter as the first parameter, or as the first argument, and 4 as the second argument, then the sum will equal to 9. And what I want to do here after we have created this variable here and this computation has been made, I want to pass the sum as an argument to my callback function. So I want to pass the sum like this. And then when what we want to do now is to basically create this callback function, or this function here. This is the callback function, and then the function that we call is the one we want to create up here, which will be the one that will be passed as a parameter here, passed as an argument here in the CB callback parameter. And here I just basically want to create a new function then called show result, and this is going to take in a parameter, which is basically just it's going to be an arrow function, and it's going to take a parameter which will basically be the sum here that we pass to it. So what I will say here is I will just call this parameter sum. And the only thing this is going to do, this function, is that it's going to console.log out the sum. So what's going to happen here is that when we call this calculate function, we're going to pass it a number for number 1, a number for number 2, and then we're going to pass it show result as the callback. And what it's going to do then is that it's going to take number 1 and add it to number 2 and set it as the sum variable. And then it's going to pass this sum variable to our callback function, which in this case will be show result. And then it's going to be show result then when it's called is just basically responsible for logging out the sum here. So what I would do then here is that I would just call this function by just calling calculate here. So calculate, and then I will say 5 as the first argument for number 1 here, and then maybe 4 as the second argument here for number 2. And then I want to call show result as the third argument. And when we set or invoke basically a function like this as an argument, we don't use the parentheses like this. Then it won't work. We just put the name of the function we want to use as our callback. And then if I save this now and I take up the console here and refresh the page, we see the number 9 here. So we call calculate, we pass it 5 for number 1, 4 for number 2, and show result as the callback here. So then it adds number 1 and number 2, so 5 and 4, and sets it as the sum variable. Then we call our callback function, which in this case is show result, as we have set here as the third parameter. So as the callback function, show result. And then as an argument for show result here, we pass the sum. And then when show result is called from here, it basically just takes the sum here that we have passed as an argument and logs it out to our console. And that is basically how a callback function works. And why this is representative of asynchronous JavaScript is that this callback function won't be called until this sum is set. And to simulate this in a more realistic way, I will simulate the request being made to a server by using the setTimeout function, which basically lets us fire off some code within a code block after a certain amount of time has passed. So what I will do is that I will basically create this callback function again called, and instead of show result, I'm going to call it show data. And it's gonna basically be exactly the same as the one we created up here, show result, but instead here I will say data, and then it's gonna console.log out the data it has been passed. Then what I'm gonna do is I wanna create a function called basically we can call it get data to simulate a server request. Get data, and the only parameter that this get data function takes is the callback, which in this case it will be the show data that we will call when we call this function later. We will set show data as the parameter of get data, and this will also be an arrow function like this. And then here, to simulate this server request that sometimes the function can take a little bit of time, I will use the setTimeout, the method here, or setTimeout function. And the setTimeout function, it takes a function as its first argument, or as its first argument, and then as its second argument, it takes the time in milliseconds that this function is about to wait before it fires off whatever we put in this code block here. So I want it to take 2 seconds, and in milliseconds that becomes 2000 milliseconds equals 2 seconds. And then here I will want to create a variable which I will call data, and I will set that equal to basically just a string. Here is some data, and then I want to pass this data variable to my callback function. So cb data. So when the callback function is called, it's going to take this data variable here and pass it to whichever function we has put in here as the callback, and we're going to put in show data as the callback when we call get data. And then, as I said, this function here is going to wait 2 seconds before it fires off whatever is in this code block. So before it's going to wait 2 seconds before it calls basically this callback function. And the thing we're going to do next is just to call get data, and get data takes one argument, which is this callback parameter here, and in this case we want it to be the show data, because show data will be our callback function. So it's going to take show data, and what's going to happen now is that when we call get data, it will pass the show data function as a callback here, and we will set basically it will pass the show data function as the callback here, and then it's gonna run this setTimeout function here, and it's gonna look at the code within it, and as well as the amount of time it's going to set before it fires off this code. And what it's going to do then is going to set this data variable here to this string, and then it's going to call this callback function, which is equal to the argument that we passed here to get data. And then it's going to pass on this data here as an argument to get to show data, to show data, which is equal to the callback function. And then when show data is called here, it's going to take the data here as it receives as an argument, and it's going to console.log it out to the screen. And this will happen after 2 seconds. So if I save this and then refresh this, I'm going to see that it takes a little bit of time. And then here is some data popped up after 2 seconds. If I refresh this again, we can see this in action again. First we see just 9 there from the previous function, and then here is some data came out. So that is the beauty of a callback function, that it can wait for a computation to being able to finish before continuing on to run the code in this specific code sequence. And in parallel of this, basically any other function can run. And this we will see later on when we start to create more functions here and see that they will basically finish in not in sequence as they are called, but in sequence with the time that they are finished computing, basically. But that is basically it regarding callback functions and how they work. It's basically a function getting passed as a parameter like this to another function. That is a callback function.